Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Make Things Better podcast. Today I have Gemma Milne on the show. Gemma is a writer and researcher in tech and science, and I've just read her book, Smoke and Mirrors. So we're going to be talking a lot about hype in this podcast. But first of all, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background, Gemma.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be on the show. A little bit about me. As you say, I'm a writer and a researcher. I'm currently a researcher. I'm doing a PhD at UCL at the moment in the Science and Technology Studies department, and I'm specifically looking into kind of like the ethics and political economy of corporate futurists. So I'm really interested in people who talk about the future and get paid to talk about the future in corporate contexts, and kind of what's, I don't want to say the right way of doing that, but what are all the intricacies, the systems, the types of people that end up doing that, and how it impacts the world. But beyond that, I write about science and tech of all sorts for freelance writers, so for all kind of outlets. My background's pretty varied. I have a maths degree, but I've worked in advertising and investment banking, and I was a chef for a little while. So I've done lots of different stuff, which I think kind of informs how I think about the world. I tend to have quite a multifaceted view on things, and I really like to try and think about systems and how things work, and I don't know, how the meat was made, I suppose, or how the sausage is churned, or whatever the phrase is. I don't know how it goes, but anyway.
So it's not from being a chef.
Yeah, maybe it's that, I don't know. But yeah, I don't know, I've always been really drawn to trying to work out how the world works, whether it's trying to understand the depths of mathematics or physics or whatever, or trying to understand social systems or whatever. So I suppose that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and I was just saying before we started recording that I loved your book because there was so much critical thinking involved, and you didn't just learn about these 12 different, or I can't remember how many there were, but these
9.
different, was it 9? Yeah, my bad. There was so much to take in. I learned so much from that book, honestly. Just finished it this week. You want to tell us actually a little bit about Smoke and Mirrors and what it was about in general?
Sure. So Smoke and Mirrors, the subtitle is How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. So, it's a book about how hype works in the world, specifically of science and technology, or the future more generally. There's 9 different chapters, and they cover everything from cancer therapeutics to farming and food to space commercialization, even looking at like aliens and life on other planets. So kind of 9 different areas that I think have legitimate, real good science in it, but are often plagued by misleading headlines, ideas and excitement and idealism that can take people along the wrong path, perhaps, of understanding, and frankly make those areas of science tech less interesting. I think a lot of people think if I've written a book about hype, I must be a massive pessimist and a Luddite or whatever, but I'm not at all. I just think that it's much more fascinating to kind of critically think and engage with science tech, as opposed to being either afraid of it or thinking it's too difficult or so on and so forth. So I wanted to pick quite what a lot of people see as quite difficult topics, even things like quantum computing or AI, to try and encourage people to get a bit more involved. And it's not, I struggled with like picking the genre of the books. It's not really popular science because it's got quite a lot of politics and history and economics and other things in there. I always try and caution people and say, you don't have to be like a expert in science tech to enjoy this book. I really try and make it a bit more of this, as I say, the sort of system, how the world works kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you say at the end that like everyone should be sort of aware of hype, or well, they don't have to be aware, but it's something that anyone can get interested in. I know at the end of the book you were mentioning how you don't need to be interested in science and tech, or you might have your own psychological biases where you feel like you don't know enough about science and tech and you may be a bit fearful of it because of that. But I do think anyone could really read your book because it just does apply to so many different things in life. The other thing is I thought it was quite balanced, how like there's some areas in it where you talk about how things are being a little bit hyped up, and then there's other things that are kind of because of hype as well in the past now people are fearful that nothing's going to happen, or they don't think anything's going to happen in certain sort of industries either because of hype in the past. And that was quite interesting to me. So you touch on 9 different ways in which hype can kind of have a negative sort of impact, or what it can lead to. The first one was hype maintains the status quo. Do you want to tell us a little bit how hype can do that?
Sure. So if you think about certain kinds of, I'm going to keep saying headlines because that's how most people tend to come across hype, particularly if you don't work in science and tech. So, there's many different headlines that are associated with different kinds of science and tech, which you probably would recognize. So for instance, one that's alongside artificial intelligence or AI would be robots are going to steal our jobs, for instance. That's like a sort of standard headline that you would associate with that technology. If you're going to talk about cancer therapeutics, then a standard headline would be X is going to cure cancer, or X can delay cancer, prevent cancer, or something like that. And it is talked about as a sort of collective. It's this kind of battling sort of narrative and so on and so forth. And it's the same with many different areas of science and tech. Now, what these headlines do is they tend to, I guess, have people culminate in one idea or a set of ideas about the technology without really giving you that much information about it, without really allowing you to ask any questions beyond it. It kind of stops your thinking. So if we were to look at the AI one in particular, robots are going to steal your job, if you read that headline, or you see Terminator or something like that, there's sort of one of two things you can think. One is, oh, the robots are coming to get us, they're, invading, if you're going to have the more sort of, shall we say, crazy or extreme version of it. Or maybe you're thinking, yeah, they're going to steal my job, and oh no, that's really scary. The other side is maybe you'd think it'd be liberating, right? Great, I don't have to do boring jobs anymore because AI is going to come, or the robots are going to come and do it for me. But either way, that's quite a limited way of thinking about AI, right? You're not really going beyond this idea of there's this robot coming, it's this other thing, it's not human, and it's going to do something to me, it's going to impact me. That's really all that headline is saying. But if you were to think about basically the same idea in a different way, and the idea is around automation, it's around this idea that robots, AI, technology can automate certain tasks that humans do. And if you wrote the headline in a different way, for instance, large corporates are making active decisions to replace human labor with machines in the name of profit. That's a completely different way of talking about arguably the exact same thing. And it completely opens up your mind to whole new questions. Suddenly you're going, wait, who are these corporates? And wait, who's making a decision at the corporate? Or well, in the name of profit, that doesn't seem fair. What about care work and health and so on and so forth? In the UK, we don't pay for that. What does profit come into that? So on and so forth. So what hype does and what headlines do in these sort of standardized ideas about certain areas of science and tech is they kind of don't allow you to think outside the box, as pithy as that sounds. They just reiterate the same sort of ideas, the same fears, the same emotions, the same kind of assumptions that you might have. And it stops you from thinking anything different. Now, when we're talking about status quo, that also means that you might not vote in a different way. You might not spend your money in a different way. You, as a company, might not change the way that you innovate. As a government, you might not change your policies. So really, these kind of narratives can sometimes cement a lot of thinking, sometimes bad thinking, and therefore not allow any change. Sometimes people would say it would prevent progress, but depends what your conception of progress is, really.
Yeah, the other sort of example that you gave that was quite similar to that was the one about Elon Musk and the brain-computer interfaces. And I actually watched that Joe Rogan podcast that I think you did mention in the book many, many months ago. And that can actually be quite dangerous, though, because as you sort of mentioned, people might think that that's actually going on and that's maybe more developed than it actually is. And then there's other people who are kind of working on similar things, and then they already think, oh yeah, that's already been done, but it might not have already been done. And so that's the other way, I suppose, that it can maintain that status quo and actually result in people not developing things as much as they perhaps would have done.
Absolutely. And I think it's that sort of age-old thing around how do we try and change mindsets in order to change behaviors or change the way we do things. And particularly certain things that happen in society, and I'm sure everybody will have an example to hand where you're frustrated about how things are done. It's not fair, it's not right, it's inefficient, whatever your complaint is. And a lot of time when you really boil down as to like why stuff isn't changing, it is concrete mindsets. It's well, this is just the way we've already done it, or nobody's pushing for us to change, or well, those people over there are working on it, according to the headline that I just read yesterday, or whatever it is. And so there's this sort of, it kind of gets you off the hook, I suppose, of having to make any change. And that the very first chapter of the book is the farming chapter, and that's the one I sort of associate with this idea of status quo, because that's a perfect example where we read about how we need to make change to the way that we consume, the way we farm, the way we do things. And there's lots of debate around whether it's veganism or whether it's buying locally or whether it's, smallholder farms, like all different ways, which all have their merits. But ultimately, sometimes the narratives around, oh, there's this, startup in Silicon Valley that's going to grow lab-grown meat, or there's this tech company that's going to allow us to, grow vegetables inside in vertical farms. You kind of go, oh, well, I guess I don't need to change my consumption habits because it's being solved. And so sometimes the hype and the enthusiasm and the idealism, it just kind of, sometimes because we don't want to change, because we find it hard to change, whether it's in our jobs and being asked to do something by our manager, or whether it's our own personal consumption habits, or so on and so forth. These kind of narratives gives us a way out, shall we say, and particularly with things like how we consume, how we, whether or not we live our lives in a more quote unquote ethical way, and so on and so forth.
Sure. You touched on farming and veganism as an alternative there. It just reminded me of, I was on the phone to my granddad last week, and he was talking about, I think they're called Beyond Burgers. And
yeah.
He was sort of hinting or maybe suggesting that that'd be a good place to put money in that company right now, because he's quite into investments. And I'm actually going to send him your book, because I was talking to him about it quite a lot the other day. He's really into current affairs and everything. So
cool.
Yeah, that'll be good for him to read as well.
Awesome.
But there could possibly be hype around that as well, because there could be other companies and there's going to be competitors. It's like, just because that's the company right now getting all the headlines, that doesn't necessarily mean that in 5 years' time that's going to be the main company that are using different ways to create these sort of burgers that are so similar to real meat. So that can be dangerous as well.
There's something to be said though about, so this is one of the things about hype that I think is interesting, can have negative effects in many ways, but is part of, I didn't want to write a book that was just like, hype is terrible. I mean, I suppose that was the original idea, but when you start looking at it more, you realize that it's way more complicated than that. So when you look at things like investment, whether it's private investors or venture capitalists or big banks, no matter what kind of level you're looking at, investors are not necessarily looking for something that has actual value in the real world. You're looking for something that is going to have a change, that's going to have value in the sense that your position changes in value. It's not really about whether or not the thing actually works or comes into the world or whatever. So trading is hype. That's what that is. Now, that doesn't mean that all trading and all investment is bullshit. Like that's not what that means. However, as we've seen so many times throughout history, a lot of money can be made out of absolutely nothing, out of narrative, out of storytelling. And so companies like Beyond Meat and the ones that are associated with a lot of the, hypey science and technology ideas of today, they will probably go up in terms of their value because people are excited about them, and that's what happens in the markets. But at some point, some of them, maybe all of them, I don't know, will also plummet in the same way that happens if you end up having something that doesn't have a core sort of value at the center. Now, I'm no futurist, or nobody is. I don't know if Beyond Meat, as you say, is going to be the one or not the one or whatever, but I suppose it's the nature of betting when it comes to investment. But I think it's worth pointing that out when you think about hype, because, and this is the reason why I didn't want to just say, oh, let's work out what's hypey and say why it's bad. You have to actually look at the sort of phenomenon of hype in order to kind of utilize it in the real world. Otherwise, you just get loads of facts about hype or facts about science and tech. You have to understand what hype actually is. It's not understanding, it's attention seeking. And so when you understand that a headline or a narrative or a sales pitch or whatever it is literally there just to capture your attention, it's very easy to then go, well, I better ask more questions. Whereas if you look at it as understanding, as knowledge, as truth, you're not necessarily going to take the next step and go, well, hang on a second, let me look at this. Now, again, it doesn't mean that every headline out there is hype and it's rubbish, but you need to grab attention for things that are truth, for things that are false, for things that are a little bit of a stretch, so on and so forth. That's like the attention economy we live in right now. So what I try to encourage people to do is not to go, oh, that's hypey, don't pay attention. It's to go, that's hypey. Why are they using hype? Who's that useful for right now? It could be useful for me. It could be useful for them, most likely useful for them. That's why they're doing it in the first place. But what's the sort of like, I don't know, mechanics of it? Why is that working? Are they using emotional language? That's a bit of a trick. Okay, let me see if I can go past that trick and see if there's actually something in this, or if they're just capturing me because it's emotional. So that's kind of what I try and say with, when you look at hypey stuff, it's not about seeing whether or not something has value based on the headline. It's about it being a door for you to then explore yourself, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And I think having that awareness of something, whether it is hype or not, can be so incredibly powerful, because, as you said, you can use that to your own advantage. Say with crypto, how many people out there would have bought crypto but have not valued it that much? So like, people would have been buying it despite like some coins maybe not having intrinsic value. They would have still be buying into it because they're aware of future hype and how that will make them money. So talking about crypto, what's your opinions on this? It's a very sort of hot topic, I suppose. You know, over the last few years, it's been getting a lot more media coverage. How much hype do you think there is in crypto?
I think that crypto is hype. That's what, like, you get. We just wouldn't. And okay, so let me rewind the clock back a little bit. I think that some of the arguments around the ideas behind blockchain and cryptocurrencies, around, you know, decentralization and empowerment and, you know, getting away from these centralized bodies and so on and so forth, have merit, right? Of course, you know, it's quite difficult to argue with that sort of thing as being a good thing in the world. But I think it would be incorrect and also naive to say that that is the role that these currencies and this idea has in the world today. And because of hype, cryptocurrencies are not currencies. they are, you know, they're assets that people trade, right? They're not liquid, or some people would argue they are liquid, but you'd be stupid to buy a t-shirt with crypto. Like, you that's daft. Why would you do that? You would keep it and wait for the price to change and then trade it. Like, that's what people do with it now. And you've had many people talk about the fact that you know, how stupid was I 5 years ago, you know, using Bitcoin in a vending machine? I should have just kept it. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's not something that we're using as money, right? And it's the same with kind of blockchain ideas. We talk about this idea of it being empowering, and it, you know, you hear these narratives of it decentralizing things. No, it's not decentralizing, it's not democratizing. It is a very good distribution tactic, but that's very different. There's still centers of power, people with various different kinds of power controlling things. So yes, in theory, the technology can do all these things that it says it can do, in the same way that any technology can do really good things. A gun can be a good thing, but it isn't, because it kills people. So, you know, or people use it to kill people, rather, is probably the better way of putting it. And it's the same, in my opinion, with a lot of things around crypto. Now, if you're just in it to get a quick buck and you want to trade, well, yeah, I mean, it's the same as trading currency or any kind of other equity or whatever that you want to trade nowadays, securities, debt. But that's a different conversation than talking about it as a sort of liberating or emancipatory thing that exists in the world. And I mean, you mentioned before we came on about that, the thread from the Dogecoin or Dogcoin, never know how to pronounce it, guy. And I think he was that went sort of viral last week. He was spot on where he was saying, I just think that it's now this, thing that libertarians and capitalists and not great people utilize. And I think that that's true. I don't think it makes you an inherently bad person if you want to make a quick buck, but that's your own decision as to whether you want to dabble in something which is arguably ethically quite questionable. And then of course you've got all the energy stuff around it too. So I had a lot of people ask me why I didn't do a chapter in crypto on a book on hype, but I was like, you write a book and it doesn't come out for like a year. There's no point me writing anything on crypto now. It'll be out of date by the time the book's published, and it'll be out of date and within a month or within a week of the book being out in the world. So, but I think it's a good place to kind of think about hype and think about how it plays out and think about what happens when things go wrong with it and so on and so forth. It's just a great case study.
Yeah, it is just changing all the time, so I can see why that would be difficult. Were there any other topics that you attempted to write about that you didn't include in the book?
I considered writing about VR for a little bit, but I only wanted to put in, how do I put this? I only wanted to put sort of legitimate stuff in the book that I think I could make an argument for in the sense of it being worthwhile to some degree. And I don't see that with virtual reality or augmented reality. I think those are technologies that have been massively buoyed up by a lot of different kinds of hype, particularly in spaces like advertising. I used to work in advertising, and VR and AR were huge there around, how could you put adverts, at the side of football pitch if you're watching a virtual football game and all this sort of stuff. And I became very disillusioned. Also, very simply, I get car sick, and the minute I put a pair of goggles on, I get super ill. So, and they haven't solved that yet. So I don't see it becoming a sort of the big thing it says it is. So that was another topic that I couldn't really, maybe from a medical education standpoint, it's maybe the only kind of argument I can think of that it becomes a sort of world-changing technology. So I only really wanted to include things that I think it would be useful for people to know about from a more positive standpoint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like all of your topics, there were things that would probably impact people across the world on like quite a macro scale. Whereas with VR, I think I was speaking to someone about it the other day who was on the podcast about accessibility, and she was saying how like so many people do get sick from using VR, and less than 3% of people have ever actually used any VR in their life, and so on. And so, yeah, I can see why you'd possibly leave that out.
It's not at all comparable to how much is spoke about, right? Although I would argue actually nowadays, like 2021, it's definitely cooled off, whereas when I was sort of started thinking about the book, which would have been about 2017, 2018, it was still a very hot topic in terms of industry press, tech press, and so on and so forth. But I'm not, not trying to say I knew it was going to cool off, but I didn't really feel like it has the future that it was being written about. So I figured it would be out of date by the time I wrote about it, and perhaps just not worthy of a whole chapter. I didn't think there was enough in it. So yeah, and again, I didn't want any of the topics in the book to feel like they were included and then I was just sort of saying, this is absolute rubbish, don't pay attention. It's going, no, there's loads of hype, but that also means you have to pay attention. It's not about discarding it and saying, oh, that's super hypey. AI is hypey, so let's not think about it. It's like, no, there's actually a lot of really important things we need to consider with these technologies. And they are having impact, and they will continue to have impact. But if we don't reckon with them in a way, then that's when the hype becomes really dangerous, and it goes back to the sort of status quo sort of thing. Whereas something like VR was like, I don't think it matters if some people don't really pay attention to it, at least not at the moment. Maybe in the future I'll be in my hat, who knows?
Yeah, fair enough. During your research, because I'm sure you must have done quite a lot of research, right? Was there anything that stood out to you as possibly the most exciting in terms of new technologies for the future?
Gosh, I mean, I suppose it depends on what you're interested in. Because I think what makes technology really interesting is not necessarily the tech itself, unless you're just the sort of person that really loves getting into the intricacies of how things are built or the science behind it, so on and so forth. I think it's more around what kind of impact it's going to have on society, on culture, on the way we live our lives, and the way we even talk about the technology at hand. So I suppose, for me, the chapter that I found most intriguing to write about was probably around fusion technology, because I felt like it's something that not a lot of people know very much about. People are very confused about it. They get mixed up with fusion and fission, thinking it's the same as nuclear technology now, but which it's not, or they think it's pseudoscience, which is not. And I think it has the way things are working with how it's being developed is fascinating. It's quite a kind of drama-filled story, which I go into in the book. But it also, genuinely does have the potential as a technology to be hugely impactful and completely, not to sound hyping myself, but to change energy systems, which is something that I think we don't really hear that much about, like what would it mean to, we hear about renewables, but, it's the idea of, oh, they can just plug into our existing systems. It's like, well, could this, new technology actually do that? And then you think, well, what does that mean? Do we have to rebuild pipes? And what does that mean for me turning on my light? All these sorts of things that I think for me, technologies that sort of change those kind of conversations and change how we think about these massive, as you say, macro systems, to me is more exciting than a new gadget or something that's kind of, a lot of people get really excited about brain computer interfaces, which I completely understand. But for me, I kind of see them as sort of gadgets to some degree, which is interesting, but I don't think has the same sort of like real world scale as something like energy.
Yeah, and I had no idea about the fusion project that's going on in Europe.
In France, yeah.
In France, is it? Yeah. How much money did you say was put into that? It was a huge sum.
God. Yeah, it depends when you're counting from. I've got here by 2014, the cost had soared to 10 times the original figure, almost $50 billion. But that was 7 years ago, so it'll be a lot more now. But yeah, ITER is the biggest science experiment on the planet, and nobody's heard of it. ITER, but you pronounce it ITER. And it just completely blew me away that it's not so much the money, it's not even, because I think you say these big numbers, and for me, I don't remember numbers. It doesn't really mean something to me when you say 50 billion versus 50 million. I'm like, okay, whatever, one's bigger than the other. But it's the scale by which there's many different nations working on this. It's physically huge. It takes up tons of space, and it's been going for such a long time. And I think when you sort of discover something like that, of such scale and magnitude, that is not it's not talked about to the state that it doesn't feel like it's relative to the way we discuss it, if that makes sense. That's when I get quite interested. And when I sort of heard about ITER or discovered ITER years ago, it's always been that sort of thing of like, why don't I hear about what's going on here? Why is this not in the news? In the same way that we talk about CERN, or we did talk about CERN tons, and all the controversies around that, how expensive it was, what science they were doing, so on and so forth. But with ITER, it's just kind of almost silence. You could easily have news reports about how we're spending so much money on this, or France has said this, and the US has said that, and Japan has said that. There's loads of geopolitical stories, all sorts, but it just seems to have kind of slipped under the radar. Until now, though, it's getting more coverage now because things are starting to heat up with them quote unquote turning on in 4 years' time in 2025. So I expect there'll be a lot more coverage coming out, but without people having the context, you just have this science experiment in the south of France, and you're like, I don't even know what fusion is. Why are all these nations doing it? Why is there controversy? I don't want my money to be spent on this. And then you get all the political narratives and so on and so forth. So again, without having that ability or the confidence to like dive in and go, hold on a sec, what is this? And why aren't people talking about it? Or why haven't they in the past? It can be so easy to sort of fall into the trap of perhaps not fully getting it. And that's what I always try and get away from when it comes to science tech coverage.
Sure. How much do you think complexity impacts hype and headlines? Because I think fusions, it's a lot harder to come up with a good headline on fusion energy and ether than it is to say robots are taking our jobs or we're going to cure cancer.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could argue there is a very good headline for fusion, which has burnt it in the past, which is limitless energy. That's the headline around fusion. The thing is that it's become a joke, so people don't really believe it. And it is hyperbolic. However, there's always elements of truth and hype. But anyway, I'll let people do their own Googling, or they can read the chapter to read a bit more about it specifically. But with complexity, I would say that is one of the things that's massively at the root of why hype propagates, and why we seek out hype. We want simple answers. You want to be able to Google something and get the answer. You want to be able to know, do you know what, if I have this vegan meat instead of this normal meat, am I doing better for the planet? Yes or no? And the answer, it depends, is unsatisfying, and it's work. When someone says it depends, you think, oh God, well, what else do I need to know in order to understand this fully? How much research do I need to do? What sources am I going to? I don't even know where to start. And so there's a resistance to things that are complex. And again, it sounds pithy, but like, the world is complicated. Like, it's not simple. And if we keep seeking out these simplified ideas, that we're not going to understand. That is the reality. And so it's harsh, but it's true. So you kind of have the choice of, well, I need to get more comfortable with complexity. I need to work out strategies or emotional ways of dealing with it, because a lot of people don't deal emotionally with complexity, or I stick my head in the sand, don't do anything. And it's your choice which one you want to do. What's dangerous is when you think you understand something without delving into the complexity, because you've read something overly simplified. But it's interesting. I think this last year, coronavirus, how many minutes we've gone in, we hadn't mentioned coronavirus. Look at that. Amazing. But anyway, it's here now. I think talking about complexity before coronavirus to people, I don't want to say our generation, but the sort of people alive now, shall we say, who are engaged with media, adults, was sometimes quite a difficult task, right? To try and make this case that, we need to think about systems and things can be both right and wrong at the same time, and it's complicated and all that. And whenever people were asking me, and when I was being interviewed before about things, they would say, how should journalists change the way we do things? And I would always say they have to write about systems. You can't write about solutions, you have to write about systems. And everyone's like, nah, that's boring, that's too difficult, whatever. And then coronavirus comes along, and suddenly there's no toilet roll in your Sainsbury's, and people are going, hold on a second, this is complicated. There isn't a simple reason for this. We have to try and look at this integrated system, and we have to try and work out how things flow. And wait a minute, healthcare is related to retail, which is related to vacations, which is related to like my mental health. Who knew it? And I don't want to say that people were stupid before and they're not now. That's not the case. It's just we weren't really used to talking about things in this sort of system frame. And that's basically the only way we've been able to talk about, or we've had to talk about, coronavirus over the last year, because there's no other way of reckoning with it. We have to look at it as this thing that has impacted global systems of all kinds. So I think that, one thing that could be positive to come out of coronavirus, and there's obviously so many negatives, is that I do think our propensity to think about and accept complexity is a bit higher, because we're expecting it from the media. And we're not expecting simple answers anymore on coronavirus, even though we are demanding them. We're saying to the government, please tell us what to do. But we all know it's not that simple. There isn't a simple answer here. It's really difficult. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be leadership, don't get me wrong. But I think that hopefully will have good impacts in terms of how people think about hype in all different areas of life, and all different ways that they get their media and all different topics. The world is interconnected and not simple. And particularly when you're talking about really complicated things like energy systems or food systems or health systems, or, international travel, anything that is requiring, science, tech, law, politics, social, societal culture, like finance, all different things. If you're trying to find a simple answer, you're most likely going to miss something. You're also unfortunately never going to get a total full picture, because that's also impossible. So yeah, I try and help in the book kind of show how you can somehow try to construct a bit of a map of how to navigate these systems and how to think about them, to at least have a bit more information than just what you would get in a headline.
Sure, it's a really good way of thinking about things, in my opinion. I think what we'll find probably more challenging for people in like my generation and people even younger in the future is probably having that attention span, because of the internet and that easy access to all the information you could want, and just like quick Google search. It is going to be something that is going to become a challenge, I think, in the future, because it's something that I think a lot of people do struggle with. You mentioned in your book actually that there's people now buying these tools, which is all related to the BCI, brain computer interfaces, where they're meditating with some use of technology, and they're buying it for hundreds of pounds. And that just didn't make much sense to me, because for me, it's like the whole point of meditation is surely to like train your mind to get better at concentrating yourself, rather than using something external to do that. And so that's kind of the direction we're going into. And that just seems like such a lazy way of going about trying to achieve the task that you want to achieve.
Well, yeah, I mean, you brought up so many themes here that, like, you can think about this on so many levels. Okay, so think about it from a market perspective. You're saying, you know, people can just Google things, da, 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 da. Yeah, people are there to fill this gap of simplicity that we want. People will sell you stuff. That is the answer. Lots of, there's the way that certain things are spoke about, products as well. You know, this toothbrush is the one that's going to save you from mouth cancer, whatever. No, that's not how it works, you know. But the point I'm making is, because we have a hunger for these kind of narratives, and these kind of solutions, shall we say, people will offer it. They're not always evil people, they're not bad people, they think they're being helpful. Sometimes they're just out to make money. But the point is that there's a market for this stuff. So that's the first thing. You also touched on this point about meditation. I think that it's been written about so much, this sort of cultural trend that we have around productivity, about making the most of our time, about, you know, have a bath, but make sure you listen to a podcast at the same time so that you're not wasting the time in the bath. If anyone's in the bath, listen to this right now, be my guest, relax, turn it off, listen to this later. But the point I'm making is, like, right, we know this sort of feeling that we kind of have to be doing stuff all the time. And I think that also plays into the hyped up narratives, because when you feel like you've got an answer to something, you can almost put it to bed. You can be like, okay, sorted that, right, what's next on my to-do list? What's next I need to read about? What's next to understand? So on and so forth. It doesn't really kind of allow for this exploratory, contradictory ideas. You know, veganism is good and is also bad. How do I deal with that? You know, and I think there's a sort of tension that a lot of people have nowadays, and a lot of it's linked to the fact they don't have time, because we live in, you know, capitalist economy that's not great for people. But the point I'm making is, it's not just because people are science tech is inherently hypey. It's linked to the fact that this is how markets work, which is why we have an attention economy in the first place. But it's also linked to a lot of social trends and cultural trends that we all feel as individual human beings, that then is, you know, both influenced by the market and the society that we live in, but also constructs the market and the society we live in. So it's really difficult to break out this stuff, is what I'm trying to say. And I think if you kind of allow for that, there must be an answer to this simplicity idea. You know, my email is a mess. There must be a Google Chrome plugin that will sort my email, you know. And then you kind of think about it and think, there's probably something deeper here than me just not being able to organize my email. Maybe I'm getting too many. Maybe I'm signing up for too much stuff. Maybe I'm trying to get too many opportunities. Maybe I should step away from my laptop for 5 minutes. You know, it's more than these kind of simplified band-aid over a gaping wound solutions. And I think it's that kind of thinking that we need to shift as well, not just the complexity stuff, but like, why am I even averse to things being complex in the first place? What's that? How does that feel?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, because it made me think about how our society now is sort of set up, because we create, as humans, we often create our own world, like we create our own reality. So we've constructed a society which perpetuates our inane faults and our inane desires and innate, sorry, I don't know why I'm using the wrong word, but
well,
yeah,
they're inane as well sometimes, to be fair.
True. So yeah, it's just like a perpetuation of our human biases into society, and then we have to go and deal with those again because we've socially constructed all of this. That's quite an interesting perspective to have, and I've not really thought about it too much like that before. In terms of your book as well, and like kind of having that checklist, that productivity, I kind of like just went through your book quite quickly over the last like 3 or 4 weeks, like ever since I asked you to come on the podcast and you fortunately agreed. I was like, yeah, let's get this done. Come on, I want to read this. So yeah, got into it and really enjoyed it and everything. But if I didn't have that checklist of like, I need to read this, I want to, know about this, I probably would have spent even more time sort of going through it, researching all the different names, researching all the different topics in a bit more detail myself. And I think that's kind of where that simplistic thinking can be a little bit detrimental, where you are trying to like just check things off, because then you're not exploring topics in as much detail as you probably want to and what would be better. It's like I have this goal for the end of this year to read, I think, like 20 books over the next 5 months. And really, that's probably not that healthy. That's probably is kind of pushed onto me due to culture and society and productivity and all these hacks and so on, whereas maybe it'd be better for me to just take my time, maybe read like 1 or 2 books and really explore it in a lot more detail.
Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I definitely agree with you in many ways, but to the tradition of Smoke and Mirrors, it's more complicated than that. I too have, every year I'm like, I'm going to read X many books this year. I need to finish this book this week because otherwise I'll be off target, or, so I do. And I do that with everything, with my emails, with my writing, with, hold my hands up in the air. Productivity. I'm a nerd like that. I like that stuff. I like to-do lists. I think that there's a difference though between succumbing to it and it ruling your life, and you taking a step back and being like, this is just how my brain works, and I know there's limits to that, and it's probably going to cause me issues sometimes, but I'm willing to make that compromise because it makes me unhappy to not finish books quickly or whatever else. So I think it's about thinking about it, right? It's not about saying this is wrong or this is bad or so on and so forth. And like one example specifically with Smoke and Mirrors, and you mentioned it right at the start, where I have in the conclusion a sort of like checklist of nine things that you can do to help your critical thinking. Now, I thought long and hard about whether to include this in the book, and I do sort of mention this in conclusion, that it feels antithetical to put a checklist to critically think in a book that's about not just following checklists and not just doing what you're told and thinking more broadly, right? However, I know that that's what people want from books, right? They read for knowledge. We all need shortcuts to get through life because we can't do everything fully all the time. If we read only 2 books a year, really in depth, maybe you'd get a lot from those 2 books, but think of all the books you couldn't read, all that sort of thing. So we do need shortcuts, and as long as you understand the limits of them, they're okay to take, right? I'm going to take the shorter way on the motorway instead of going the nice scenic route. I'm compromising by not getting to see the sea, but I'll get there faster. It's the same sort of calculation you do in your head, and it should be the same with any kind of these shortcuts you take in life. So I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with doing that, but again, it's just doing it mindfully, or doing it in a way that you're like, I'm understanding where this might take me along the wrong path. I need to be conscious of that. And that's, I put these 9 things in there, and number 10 is like, just please don't actually follow this list. Like, take it as inspiration and use it. Absolutely, please. I wouldn't have wrote this book if I didn't think it could be useful. But at the same time, you're right. It is about going away and researching yourself, not taking everything I say as gospel, for crying out loud, right? Because that would be hype just the same. Yeah,
that's really interesting to hear. I've got like the list here. I don't know if anyone will be able to see, but I just wrote it down before the episode started. So. But yeah, I mean, I'll be like, I'll analyze this now. I'll look at it all, spend like a few hours on each one.
No, that's what I mean.
Then at the end, I'll go, oh, why did I do that? I should have just had a bath and chilled out.
No, it's about picking and choosing the stuff that works for you at the right time, right?
Exactly.
But again, just being conscious of like, well, if I'm making a decision to dive deep into this, then yeah, it comes at the cost of not doing something else. I mean, it sounds like such an obvious thing to say, you know, limited time on the planet, all that jazz. But I do think that it's not about overanalyzing every single decision you make, going, oh, I think this will take an hour, so that's fine, or 2 hours, that's a bit much, let's not do that. That's obviously obsessive. But I do think it's about not getting to the end of something and thinking you have perhaps full knowledge if you haven't done that exploration. Sounds obvious, but I mean, the amount of folk that retweet things and think that that's gospel, and you think, well, I mean, Twitter even has a functionality now where you can't retweet if you haven't read the article. And I know this because I've tried to retweet stuff that I haven't read. So, you know, it's you're confronted with this stuff all the time, but then I'm always like, you know, excuse me, why are you policing me? But the point I'm making is that it's just about being conscious of how much you think you know or don't know, and how sure you can be of something, whilst also not, you know, turning into some conspiracy theory person that doesn't believe anything at all, because that's also not useful either, and also not true.
I guess like it just kind of comes down to being aware and trying to think rationally, and taking more time on some things than others. It's like I went into a shop the other day and I really couldn't decide whether I wanted to buy this shirt or not. I went up to the counter and I said to her, excuse me, do you have a coin on you? Because I wanted a coin to flip. So she goes downstairs to get a coin. She didn't have one at the till for some reason. I think they just took card, which is fair enough. Comes back up, flip the coin, and then it was tails. I only go ahead with anything when it's heads. So I just walked out of the shop and just wasted 2 minutes of my time. I felt so guilty. But that is how I make decisions sometimes. I honestly do. I have to do heads or tails.
Hey, so, you know, I think it's also about working out how much your decision matters, right? I mean,
exactly.
A shirt might be really important if it's what you're wearing to a funeral of a loved one, for instance. It might be, that might have a lot of meaning for you. Other times it's like, I just need a shirt. I don't really care. It just needs to look nice. And that decision doesn't really matter as much. So again, it's not being obsessive and thinking about every minute of every day in how can I make sure this is productive or useful? But at the same time, it is about, you know, making those decisions yourself. And crucially, you know, let me say that again, making those decisions yourself. What do you think is right and wrong? You know, what do you think is the best thing to do? Don't like turn to some like blue check person on Twitter to tell you, or some podcaster or whatever. Like it's think about it. We've all got the same brains at the end of the day. We've all got the capacity to think. It's just whether or not you want to spend your time doing that, and how much you sort of attribute to the ones that are perhaps spending more time or less time than you are. So, you know, Smoke and Mirrors is really, and all of my work and kind of what I believe is really about the fact that we should all feel far more empowered to get involved in thinking about, particularly with science and tech. I mean, the sort of anecdote I always use is, think about the amount of people that will have an opinion about a new album. Beyonce's got a new album out, let's say. I don't think she does, but I suppose I don't really follow Beyonce, probably a bad example. Anyway, let's say Beyonce has a new album out. Lots of people will have an opinion on it. Do all those people know how to read sheet music? Do all those people know the inner workings of a trumpet? Like, do all those people, did they study at like the Royal Academy of Music for 20 years and know how to compose an orchestra or conduct an orchestra or whatever? Like, no. But you can have an opinion because you have different ways of assessing things. And science and tech, I think a lot of people don't associate with opinion because they see it as truth. You know, like science is truth, science is knowledge. But a lot of science is not truth or knowledge. A lot of it is based on politics and what's been invested in at the right time, or the biases and the personalities of the scientists or technologists who build things in the first place, right? So opinion and thinking about how things work and how things flow through society is really, really important. And it shouldn't be something that you shy away from just because you're like, oh, I don't, you know, have a maths degree, or I don't wear a white lab coat, so therefore I have no say in this, and I couldn't possibly ever, you know, have an opinion on whether or not we should invest in fusion energy. No, you should have an opinion on whether we invest in fusion energy if you've read about it, because it's, at the end of the day, it's going to impact your life. And it's the same with any other piece of science and tech.
Amazing stuff. Thanks so much for coming on, Gemma. Final question for you before we wrap this up. What would you do, or what would you advise other people to do to make the world a little bit better?
Oh, what a question. What would I advise people to do to make the world a little bit better? I don't know. Go a walk without headphones in on your own for like half an hour, at least twice a week.
It's an
just
actionable step. Yeah, it's an actionable step.
But well, I think that, I don't know. I feel like the world would be a little bit better if we were all, I don't want to say a little bit more chilled out, because that sounds, there's people have real problems, you know. But I do think that it's, I actually really hate the term mindfulness. I think that it's been co-opted in many horrific ways. But I do think that there's something to be said about trying to just be at one with your brain for a little bit every now and again. I know I benefit from that a lot, whether that's thinking through a bit of research that I'm working on, or whether it's just like, God, I feel a bit weird today and I don't know why. And I go a walk and normally I'm kind of sorted out by the end. Top tip, if you don't want to just go a walk on your own, put your headphones in, but record a voice memo and talk to yourself out loud, because people will think you're on the phone. So you don't feel like you're being weird, because I would feel like that if I was just talking to myself at a walk. But I feel like I don't know. I think it's a good way of, it doesn't replace things like therapy, obviously, but I think it's a nice way of trying to work out what's going on in your head. And I sometimes get some of my best research ideas out there, and sometimes just work out why I'm like pissed off at my partner, and it's useful. So that would be a top tip as well. Record voice memos, but make it look like you're on the phone so you don't feel weird on a walk.
I like it. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate your time. Where can people find you and your book?
Sure. Well, you could probably, Twitter is probably the best place to find me. It's got my website link there as well. It's just at Gemma Milne, my name. And my book is called Smoke and Mirrors: How Hype Obscures Your Future and How to See Past It. And you know, you can get the paperback, you can get the audiobook, you can get the ebook. It's now available basically everywhere in the world in English. It just released in the US last month. Except like a few countries like Saudi Arabia for some reason, I don't know. Anyway, so you can get it there and have a read and let me know what you think. I'm always excited to hear what their favorite bits are, what bits they disagree with, and what bits they went and read more about and all that jazz. But yeah, probably Twitter's the best place.
Okay, thanks so much for coming on. Thank you to everyone listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.